Hey, if you have a Bible, would you grab it and open to Revelation chapter 2? Revelation 2. We started a couple weeks ago this series in Revelation, particularly those first three chapters where Jesus addresses personally his churches. And remember, in chapter 1, we see this king who is above all kings. That's Jesus. And he stands, he's not distanced from his churches. It says he stands with the church. So he's above all kings, but he's also up close and personal. And today we're going to see him just say, I know, I understand. So here, as we look at, make sure we get this, as we look at Jesus address the churches, there's going to be plenty of times where we look in the mirror and we say, I see me in that. You know, because he's got a pattern here. He says, hey, you're doing good at this. And then at this, he says, you need to cut that out. And our task, since we're not the original recipients of the letter, is to get to the heart behind that and to say, what are we doing well? What are we doing poorly? What do we need to cut out? But in all of it, we need to see Jesus better. We need to see him up close, personal, and spectacular, because that's who he is. So as we look at that, we remember we're seeing him address these 7 churches, which is an area that today's Turkey. Today, we're going to be in the church of Smyrna. It's actually the only one of the towns that's still a town today. It's present-day Izmir. Can we see the map? Remember, John is on Patmos. He's exiled, and he's writing. You'll notice the flow of the letters as they go from Ephesus to Smyrna to Pergamum. This is the ancient mail route. So there would have been a brother or sister in Christ who would have traveled to each of these and said, hey, here's what the Lord says, as he addresses their church, what's going on. Just a little bit about Smyrna. They beat out 10 other cities, the opportunity to have a temple there to Caesar. So they called it Imperial Worship. So you would go and you would make offerings to Caesar. The only people that didn't have to do that were the Jewish folks who lived there. They had an agreement with the government that they would just pay an extra tax, and if they paid the extra tax, then they didn't have to make the offerings, because they knew that would have been a sin for the Jews to do that. So they were the only ones that had to, or they were the only ones that didn't have to make sacrifices to Caesar. And this was a big deal for them. It was a source of pride. But not only that, is this town had been destroyed several times. So it had been destroyed and then rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt. So one of their sources of pride is, hey, we get to lead in Caesar worship, imperial cult, but also we're the town that came back to life. We're the town that resurrected. So we once were dead, and now we live, and we're doing well. They had in the Roman world, it's, the Olympics. Okay, so big deal. There were 4 major games. The second largest happened here. The winner, I don't know why. This is one of these things I really don't need to share, but it just kind of weirds me out, so I'm gonna. What you won if you won the Olympics was a crown made of celery. No idea why they gave that, unless it came with peanut butter. I'm out. But they get a celery crown. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is as we listen to Jesus' words, he's going to speak in terms that they're very familiar with. So this idea of being dead and now coming to life, having a crown, all of that is going to speak into their situation. Now, this is only one of only 2 churches that Jesus doesn't scold. This church is in a really bad situation, and he only has positive things for them. And, you know, as we step into the text, we've just got to get this. There are times in life when you've been good, but life goes bad. When you've tried and you've done your best, but everything just seems to fall apart. And when that happens, sometimes it tends to just keep getting worse, doesn't it? That seems to be the case here with the church in Smyrna. They were in a tight spot. We'll see here that suffering has a way of reminding us what things are really important and causing us to focus more on God. And as we do, what happens? We end up following him closer and even better. I mean, no one wants to suffer, but sometimes it draws us closer to God, and we'll find that it forces us to radically depend on him. So Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. Write to the angel of the church in Smyrna. Thus says the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction, your poverty, but you're rich. I know the slander of those who say that they're Jews, but they're not, but a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Be faithful to the point of death. I'll give you a crown of life. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. Notice Jesus says, I am, not your town, I am the first and the last. I'm the one who was dead, who has now come back to life. Jesus is the resurrected one, which means that he has priority over everything. He's the one who lives. This Jesus, who's exalted in the heavens, worshiped by the angels, he says, I know what's going on. I know your afflictions. Depending on your translation, it may say your tribulations. Now, when you read that, tribulations, don't think of a specific time frame, that's this 3.5-year time frame. Think of just the weight of life. For them, this was a present reality. The word that's translated afflictions or tribulation is the same word that they used to describe a torture that they had, where they would stack rocks on someone's chest until they couldn't breathe anymore. And ultimately, it killed them. And have you ever gone through one of those seasons in life where stuff just seems to start stacking up on your chest? And it gets heavier and heavier. And pretty soon you're going, I don't know how I'm going to make it. I don't know what tomorrow is going to hold, how I'm going to get through today. That's where the first church of Smyrna is. That's their situation. I'm going to pick apart this text in a couple of ways, because when Jesus says I know, he's saying I know to a couple of things. So I've got 3 I knows, a don't and a do. So if you go, yeah, that's 5 points, I get it. We might not get to lunch anytime soon. But here's the deal. They're important, so we're going to work through this. I know number 1. Jesus says, I know their and your afflictions. Jesus, to this church in a terrible, hard time, he says, I know. Dan talked about this in communion just a bit ago. Man, sometimes when folks are going through stuff, we want to show up and say everything in the world. We want to start trying to solve problems and give answers when perhaps our presence may be the best thing, to just sit there and be quiet. Jesus shows up and doesn't start picking apart what they're doing. He says, hey, I know. Remember, he's the Jesus that walks among the lampstands. He's the one who stands with his churches. For the church in Smyrna, this affliction was poverty. Now, there's a couple of different Greek words in the New Testament to describe poverty. Some is, hey, I'm broke. This one means they have nothing. I mean, they have nothing. Like, this level of poverty is something that, honestly, in the U.S., we really don't see anywhere. They're beyond broke, and they're to the point of starving is what this looks like. And surprisingly, Jesus says to them, hey, you're rich. If anything, it tells us that God's economy doesn't work like ours. His priorities aren't like ours. They have something greater. Even though the current situation was bleak, they have an eternal reward that will far outshine anything that they're dealing with now. And that is a promise for all Christians. What was it that Jesus said, Matthew chapter 6, about not storing up our treasures in places where thieves can come in and where rust would destroy and moth would pick at? No, our treasure's in heaven. A primary key to dealing with the difficulties of life is having a proper perspective, is seeing the end. Because if you're like me, when your whole world comes crashing in, I can't see past the present struggle. That's everything right in front of me. Not so with Smyrna. They were able to keep their eyes on Jesus even in the middle of difficulty. If your joy is dependent on things, you'll only experience joy when you have things. But if you have Jesus, you can have joy regardless of high or low, rich or poor. The point here is life can get hard. And sometimes it can be so difficult that you just don't know how you're going to make it through. Jesus says, I get it, and I know I'm with you. A suffering church like Smyrna needed the assurance that their ultimate future was greater than their present reality. I asked Cameron to run this cable up here just a minute ago. DMX cable? Is that what I think? It's some kind of speaker cable. It's something that they use, and I have no idea what it is, but I act like I know what it is. So I want you to picture this cable very quickly. This cable runs in through the kitchen and out, but I want you to imagine that it runs past the kitchen, and then it runs all the way past Morgan County. It runs through southern Indiana and far off savage places like Kentucky. And then it goes all the way to the equator and then loops back 10,000 times. If this is our lifespan, 70 years, eternity goes on further than what you could possibly even fathom. Why in the world would we spend all our time worrying about this when this awaits? Jesus encourages the church, stand firm. I know, but I'll give you something greater. I don't know what afflictions that you deal with or have dealt with. I know this about life. If you're not, you will. It happens. And I can tell you this, I won't throw easy answers at difficult problems or start grabbing verses out of context and claim that God has some kind of plan to make everything awesome. What I can tell you for sure is this, is that Jesus knows He's greater and He stands with you. He says, I get it, and I know. That perspective alone changes the way we face tomorrow. I know number two, Jesus knows their and your enemies. Now, the reality is we don't like to talk like we have enemies, but sometimes there are folks who stand out against us. To the church in Smyrna, he says, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews, but they are not. They're a synagogue of Satan. First of all, birthrights don't designate who belongs to God. They just don't. The Jewish population, remember I mentioned it, that they had an agreement with the Roman governor that they didn't have to go and make sacrifice to Caesar. Well, they were standing so much against the Christians at this point, the Christians didn't have buildings, right? They worshiped house churches. They would go to the synagogue together. It turns out that the Jewish population was going to the government saying, hang on, they're not one of us. They don't belong to us. So now the Christians were getting called out and saying, oh, if you don't belong to them, then you've got to make a sacrifice. Would you show that picture of the Agora? This is the excavation of where today it's there on the outskirts of town. That would be if you were a seamstress where you would go to sew or to sell your wares. Or if you were a silversmith, this is where you would sell that. To get into the Agora, you had to make a sacrifice. So if you're a picture of this, you're butcher, baker, candlestick maker, whatever it is you are or that you do, you now cannot get to work to sell what you do unless you're willing to make a sacrifice. And for the Christians, that is a huge issue because we can have no other gods before our Lord. Can't do that. So they're starving. Jesus says, I know. Strikes me, you know what he doesn't say is defend yourself. What he doesn't say is mount a revolution. What he doesn't say is now's the best time to attack, because that's what I would have been thinking. The church is called to lean on one another and to trust God. What Smyrna needed was for the church to gather around and to love each other and to see them through this difficulty as they trusted in their king. Because ultimately, he says, the synagogue of Satan. Notice here in this text, there's two different words that are used. Satan, from the Greek word Satan, aren't you glad you came? And then the devil, diabolos, is where we get diabolic. Satan means the accuser, the one that whispers in your ear and says, you're not good enough. You've screwed this up too many times. Why would you think that you could do this? Anybody ever heard that? Yeah. And then the devil, diabolic, the word literally means to throw through. That's dia through and balo, I throw, to throw through. Picture a bowling ball. What's it do? When it goes down, it scatters. What Satan tries to do is to come up and to question, to make accusations, and then to separate the church, to scatter the church, to get us to start to think we can't trust Christ. And if we can't trust Christ, then we're up to our own. If we can't trust God, then he wins. Maybe not at the level that the church at Smyrna was facing, but we do face slander, don't we? We've faced those sorts of things when folks talk about you, when you're caused to question who you are. Again, we hear Jesus come alongside and remind us, hey, I get it. I mean, who in the world faced it more than Jesus? There's something about when you're dealing with something, knowing or having someone with you that's actually dealt with the same thing. And Jesus says, I know. I understand. The third I know is Jesus knows their and your future. He says, look, the devil's about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Okay, Bible study time for reading Revelation, whenever you see numbers, numbers carry weight. They're there for a purpose. And when I say they carry weight, if I say 9/11, that number's got a weight to it, doesn't it? It reminds you of something. It takes you somewhere else. If I say December 7th, 1941, that number means something. If it doesn't, see Dan Bradley afterwards for a history lesson. That number means something. It has a weight to it. The number 10 in trials had something for this group. Back in the Old Testament, they would have known about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they went through 10-day tests because they wouldn't sacrifice to idols. And he's saying, hey, you're going to go through this as well. And for them, it could have meant death, just like for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they faced their 10-day test. I don't know about you, but I'd prefer most of the time that Jesus just removed the difficulty. He's God. He can do that. The problem is you and I only see it from ground level, and he has the capacity to see it from all of time. And how many of you, am I the only one that have prayed specific prayers that if I would have known how this all would have worked out, I would have prayed differently? But because I don't have that higher bird view, and because we're right here, we only see it here. And from a history standpoint, we know that whenever, and this is almost across the board, whenever the church goes through hard times, the church grows. The church learns to lean on Jesus, and the church grows. That's why, what they estimate, there may be 100 million Christians in China right now. Wow. In that, not only does the church grow, but we personally learn to trust God in difficulty. We learn when He's all you have, He's all you need. We get that, and you can hear that all you want, but until you stand in it, and Jesus becomes everything, then and only then is when you know that He's there and that He's good and that He's faithful. How many of us here today, if we went around the room, particularly those who have been Christians for longer than a minute, could testify to the way God's good in the middle of difficulty and the way that we've seen people come to Christ and the church grow in the middle of even difficulty? It's not when everything's going great. People take steps of spirituality when life gets hard. That's a perspective that we have to keep. So Jesus says, I know, and then He points them forward. Suffering may last 10 days, but remember, Jesus is the first and the last, which means that He's still king when it's over. He's still king, He's still good, He's still there when it's over. Ultimately, regardless of what happens in our lives, we know that Jesus is king, and we know that He is good, and we know that He'll be there at the end because He is the first and the last. If you ever visit, I know we come from a lot of different backgrounds, but if you ever venture into an Orthodox church, particularly a Greek Orthodox church, there's this pattern. So there'll be paintings everywhere. They're just all over the place. And typically, they work this way. There'll be whatever saint is venerated there. So if you're at St. Anne's or St. whoever, you'll see pictures of their life. Above them, you'll see the 12. Pictures of the 12 will typically be above them. And then above that, at the very tip, because there's usually a dome there, you'll see Jesus. They call Him the Pantocrator. I know that's a real fancy word that means the Almighty, because He's the one who's conquered death. And think of it, here's Jesus, who's above everything and more powerful than everything, that says, I'm the first and the last. and he's above the apostles, and then he's above the saints, and then you and I walk underneath him because Jesus stands with his church. That's the picture that their buildings tell. They tell a story. For us to always remember that this Jesus, who's above everything, who's greater than whatever struggle that you face, he's standing with you. He sees, and he gets it. So with the Pantocrator, it's one of those words I've just hoped to be able to use someday, because I had to learn it for a reason. With Jesus the Almighty, standing with his church, what's he say? He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Matter of fact, in the original language, it's emphatic here. Big exclamation mark. Don't be afraid. The one who holds you is greater than the one who's going to give you a hard time. The one who holds you is greater than the struggles that you face. We know here, at this time, there would have been a young man there by the name of Polycarp. I talked about this last Wednesday night. I know it's a goofy name, but Polycarp was a young man at this time. He was the last living link to the 12 apostles. Later on, he becomes the bishop of Smyrna. This is where he's from. He would have been alive and here at this time. He is a living example of everything we've talked about because the Jewish folks that were pushing against the Christians at the time went and turned him in. And at 86 years old, he was arrested. And he was taken before the magistrates where they said, curse Jesus, you can live. And he was like, well, that ain't going to happen. You know, as a matter of fact, his exact words were, these 86 years served him. How could I blaspheme him now? It didn't make sense to him. And they said, we've got wild animals. He said, set them free. They said, well, we've got torches. He said, you can threaten me with the fire, but I know more about a fire that will never end. This will be over in a minute. And they tried to talk to him, and he interrupted and said, what are you waiting for? Let's get this on. We saw this live out. And because of that, we know that actually the way that the church grew from that, it's God doing the best things in the hardest times. It amazes me. How can I beat fear? It's by keeping my eyes on Jesus. Recognizing he's the one that stands close. And you said, well, give me some practical tips for that. Read the gospel narratives. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you're unfamiliar with them, start with Mark. It's short and punchy, and it gets to the point. It's action-packed. When you get done, read it again. And when you get done, read it again. Read the gospel narratives and pray. Go to the book of Psalms and start praying the Psalms. Let them be your guide. I don't know, but if I start praying, and I pray a whole lot more, I'm not going to lie, I'm like a lot of other folks. I start praying a whole lot more when stuff gets bad. When I start praying when stuff gets bad, what happens is I start making even the prayers about me. The Psalms remind me that this is about a good and faithful God who comes and stands with his people, who loves his people, and who's greater. Last part of that, I would say this, is spend time with older Christians. Spend the time in the narrative, spend your time in prayer, but go clamp a hold of a Christian that's been a Christian for 50 or 60 years and say, tell me your stories. Because you'll find that you and I face things that they've had to face different things, and they've seen that God is good over and over and over. Don't be afraid. Do be faithful. So he says, do be faithful. This is my last part here. Be faithful. What's that? What does he mean with that? Keep loving God. Keep loving your neighbors. Keep loving the church. We love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbors yourself. Jesus talks over and over, a new commandment I give you, love one another. Let me tell you, we can overcomplicate this thing a lot. You want to show yourself to be faithful in difficulty, love God, love your neighbors, and love the church. His ways become our ways. The way that he approaches the world becomes ours. And here's the coolest thing of it all. He says, I'm not going to give you a crown of celery. He says, I'll give you a crown of life. Something that's entirely different than anything that the world has to offer. This whole thing about death and the second death, the reality is the first death is the start, and there is a judgment. But Jesus says, if you're faithful with me, you won't have to worry about that. None of that will affect you. I'm going to skip to the end. This won't be on the screen, but I want to skip to the end and just read you how this ends up. Think if you're the church in Smyrna who's starving to death and society is turned against them. John gives him a picture of how this ends. He said, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. The sea in the ancient world, it meant fear. In other words, you don't have any reason to be afraid. I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adored for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his people. God himself will be them, and he will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have all passed away. All of the stuff that caused this affliction, gone. He said, look. Then the one seated on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. And he also said, write, because these words are faithful and true. He said to me, it's done. I'm the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will freely give to the thirsty from the spring of the water of life. The one who conquers will inherit these things. I'll be his God, and he'll be my son. In the middle of difficulty, that sure seems to be the better place to focus. That sure seems to be the filter that we judge life through. Rather, if you're anything like me, sometimes I judge all that through my current filter. He wraps up this letter to the church of Smyrna with just this simple, whoever has ears, let him hear. In other words, if you've got a spiritual side to you, listen up. Listen to what the Spirit says to the churches, the one who's victorious. You're not going to be hurt at all by whatever happens. What a gift to a church that was hurting. Maybe a gift to someone here today who's hurting. To know that Jesus stands with you. He says, I know. Let me point your vision a little further down the road. I'm going to say this. If you don't know Jesus as Lord, or if you've got questions about what it means to follow him, just come up after the service. I'd love to just chat with you. I don't have all the answers. That's for sure. As a matter of fact, after doing this for a while, I've got probably more questions than I had when I started. But I do know this, what I'm sure of far outweighs what I don't know. That's a fact. Would you pray with me? God, thank you for your love. Thank you for your presence. Thank you that you hold us, your church, even in the middle of afflictions. Help us to always keep our eye on you. Your ways, your glory, your kingdom, on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.